You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 6th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Let us once again commit ourselves always to remember, cherish and honour those who served that day and to live up to the freedom they died for.
80 years since D-Day, leaders from around the world gather in Normandy to commemorate the event, but just how much of it is political theatre? Then is Netanyahu's job security at the heart of his decision-making? We'll ask if Israel's leader is driven by personal interest. We'll take a look at Italy's migration deal with Albania and examine the EU elections from a German perspective, before getting the latest trade and economy news and having a browse through the papers. Plus...
I'm Fiona Wilson in Tokyo, and I'll be talking about the latest idea from the city government to tackle Japan's low birth rate.
Move over, Cupid. We'll hear about state-sponsored dating and mating. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The leader of Hamas said yesterday the group demands a permanent end to the war in Gaza and Israeli withdrawal as part of a ceasefire plan. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he could deploy conventional missiles within striking distance of the United States and its European allies if they allow Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia with long-range Western weapons. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's National Democratic Alliance has formally named him to lead a new coalition government for a third straight term, a day after it regained power with a surprisingly slim majority. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, D-Day is commemorated today. It's the 80th anniversary of Operation Overlord, when 150,000 soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, marking a turning point in the Allied campaign to push back the Nazis on the Western Front, liberate France and defeat Hitler's Germany. 25 world leaders are expected to attend, with upwards of 12,000 security staff. In addition, 43,000 gendarme, police and military personnel will be deployed on land, sea and in the air. It's a military operation within itself, as well as a diplomatic show, demonstrating the unity of the West. Well, I'm joined now by Quentin Peel, Associate Fellow with the Europe Programme at Chatham House. Good morning to you and many thanks for coming in. A huge deal is being made out of this anniversary, but it wasn't ever thus. How did D-Day commemorations become such an enormous event, and why is this year perceived to be particularly important?
Well, this year, I think, is undoubtedly perhaps the last time that there are any of the real veterans who were actually there in attendance, because they're all now, if not 100, practically 100 years old. So it is a last moment from that point of view. I think the big question is it also a bit of a moment of truth for the Western Alliance? Is this the last time we'll see an American president come and make such a show? Because it undoubtedly is a show, but it's a very moving piece of theatre, and I think the more one watches, the more you realise, wow, 80 years ago, but actually this is still quite real.
But it hasn't always been commemorated this way, has it?
No, it hasn't. I mean, at the beginning, back in the 60s, General de Gaulle wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with it. He was still feeling pretty cheesed off at the fact that he had not been told about D-Day and really engaged in the whole process of this extraordinary invasion of his own country to get rid of the Nazi forces. So he was pretty unhappy at the whole thing. And even later on, Giscard d'Estaing also didn't really want to have very much to do with it. So it's really only when François Mitterrand came into power as French president that it actually became anything. And he, of course, invited famously Ronald Reagan to come and the Queen to come, and suddenly the whole event took off as the beginnings of what it is today.
And of course there are a similar, well, perhaps even more amount of world leaders there today, including Vladimir Zelensky.
Yes, I mean, this is why, in a way, Normandy has become important. I mean, Zelensky very much underlines, obviously, the support that he's getting from the NATO allies in Ukraine. But it's a support that is starting to look just a little bit threatened, all that delay in getting the US Congress to approve support. And I think that one sees across Europe also in growing doubts about Ukraine. But let me go back for a moment, because what's been so interesting about the Normandy celebrations or the Normandy commemorations over the years is how both Germany and Russia have become increasingly involved. And Germany is still very much involved. So go back to 2004, 20 years ago, who was invited for the first time? Vladimir Putin, recently elected president of Russia, and there he was, because to underline the fact that, after all, victory over Nazi Germany owed a huge amount to Russia. That was a very important moment, and one when we were trying to engage Putin. And then 10 years later, 2014, only 10 years ago, he was still invited in spite of the fact that he'd just taken over Crimea, the beginning of the horrors in Ukraine.
I mean, Russia's invitation was withdrawn this year, though I understand the conflict cost the Soviet Union 25 military and civilian lives. I mean, between France, Britain and America, we lost, if you like, 1.5 million people. So that's huge disparity. And I wonder if by not having Putin there, it's a big lost diplomatic opportunity.
Yes, I think the timing was very poor. I mean, it's been quite clear from the start that Putin wasn't going to be invited. But I think right up until just the last few days, it was possible that the Russian ambassador in Paris would have been invited to at least show some respect for that extraordinary Russian sacrifice in the war. But at the last minute, I think France has decided, look, Russia is stepping up the aggression against Kharkiv in Ukraine. We can't actually make that gesture. It's not the right moment.
Given the looming elections in so many places, how much of this event is political posturing or even political hypocrisy?
Well, I think it's up to some of the people perhaps should feel that themselves. And yet it is, as I said earlier, it's an extraordinarily moving event, and I think nobody can fail, actually, to be moved by it. But you're quite right, the coincidence with elections. I mean, today is the first day of the European elections. That's hugely important for President Macron, the host there. So he's actually facing some accusations in France that he's playing the whole thing for politics. And then you have the British elections, of course, so you're going to have Rishi Sunak is there, but so is Keir Starmer. So they are trying to be not too party political about it all. And then finally there's Biden coming, where undoubtedly Joe Biden will play this to underline and demonstrate the difference between him and Donald Trump. Infamously, there was that moment in 2018 when Donald Trump came to France and actually cancelled a trip to an American war cemetery. And allegedly he described the American soldiers in their graves there as losers and suckers. I think Joe Biden will go to that cemetery to underline the fact that he is a good Atlanticist.
Yeah. Now, France also wants to use this anniversary to recognise what officials call the plurality of memories. That means including remembering the citizens killed by Allied bombardments. I wonder if the tensions still exist around that.
There are mixed feelings, undoubtedly. 20,000 French civilians died in the battle between the US and UK, and let us never forget the Canadian forces there too, who probably made one of the greatest sacrifices. But those French civilians did die. But I was talking only last night to a French friend of mine who lives in Normandy, who said I'm very happy that these celebrations should take place. I think it's quite right that we should.
Yeah, although there's a lot of coverage also saying that people in Normandy are extremely annoyed because, A, they can't access any of these cemeteries themselves right now. It's all shut to the public. The place is crawling with security. Schools are closed. And it's really not very nice for the locals.
I can imagine that, and we know that in London too when we have big events. But nonetheless, I do think, theatre it may be, but this really underlines something else, the reconciliation between France and Germany. You've got Olaf Scholz attending as the German Chancellor. So it underlines the Atlantic Alliance and it underlines reconciliation in Europe. But it also underlines the fact of what we've lost in the last couple of years, and that, the other news today is going to be Gaza, Ukraine, horrible wars that have come back to haunt us again.
Mm-hmm. And as you were saying at the beginning, this commemoration could be seen as the end of an era and perhaps also the end of a great transatlantic partnership.
Well, if Donald Trump does come back, you're talking America first again. He is simply an unreliable ally. Joe Biden, interestingly, of course, an Irish American, and Ireland was not involved in the Second World War, but Irish soldiers were who volunteered to join the British forces as they did in the First World War. Joe Biden might have been expected to be somewhat less enthusiastic, but he's a passionate Atlanticist in contrast to Donald Trump. And I think the worry about a Trump return is very real.
And just remembering the soldiers that died in the circumstances in which they died. Of course, warfare has really moved on in many parts of the world, but in places like Ukraine, they are still fighting like that.
They are. It's horrifyingly like the First World War, in trenches and mud and tank warfare. But of course now it is drone warfare, so that gives an added sort of horror to the level of bombardment and destruction that war is causing. One looks at Ukraine and you think it hasn't changed from the First World War, except that it's even more ghastly. And
I just wonder, poets like, so dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, but it's not, we no longer believe that it's sweet and good to die for your country, do we?
I think it's certainly changed. Somebody said, I think in part of I was watching the celebrations from yesterday, said, but we fought for peace. We've not fought to kill people. We fight to make peace. And the other thing I think that's very important to remember about war is that war is never the solution. It's only to make room for a political solution. And if only they could realise that in Israel and Gaza, for example, a political solution is inevitable. So it is for Russia and Ukraine. That's the war itself is a sort of ghastly mistake that we blunder into.
Quentin, thank you very much indeed. That's Quentin Peel there, and this is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's 14 minutes past 9 in Tel Aviv, 7:14 here in London. The Israeli Prime Minister has long faced the allegation that he's prolonging the war in Gaza in order to save his own political career and stave off prosecution once he's out of office. And now US President Joe Biden has been quoted saying there is every reason for people to draw that conclusion. Though Biden was careful not to make a direct allegation himself, it's clear Israel's allies are frustrated with Netanyahu, and these sentiments have been on the rise rise since before the October the 7th attack by Hamas, when his right-wing coalition proposed a judicial overhaul. This drew huge protests from Israeli citizens, and many on the ground are calling for him to go, citing his own fear of an investigation into the attacks and a resumption of his corruption trial as the reason that he clings on. Well, I'm joined now by Julie Norman, who's a lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Centre on US Politics. Julie, thanks for coming back on the show. How significant are Biden's remarks and how far do they reflect the official US position?
Well, good morning, Georgina. I would say I think it's important not to read too much into Biden's remarks. He did preface those by saying, I'm not going to comment here. This is a domestic issue for Israel. And that's pretty much the line the administration has had. With that said, I think he, like most of the world, sees this dynamic with Netanyahu, is concerned about the politics behind some of his decisions. And I think just the fact that even that comment was made does underscore the frustration that the U.S. and Biden in particular has felt with Netanyahu, someone who he has, worked with very closely over years in the past, but has just become increasingly frustrated during the course of this war.
So if Netanyahu were to go tomorrow, what would befall him?
Yeah, so Netanyahu, even before the war, as you alluded to in your comments, was caught up first in a big domestic political issue in Israel regarding the judiciary. If he was actually voted out of office, which is looking like it could be very likely after the war, it's possible that he would be brought up again on corruption charges, which he has essentially evaded because he has remained in office and so has not had to go through the legal procedures of that. So that's certainly one consideration that I think many people have in the back of their minds as to why the war might be being drawn out.
And how close is Netanyahu to going? I mean, a couple of his right-wing colleagues are threatening to dump the coalition over this latest proposed peace deal. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the current ceasefire deal is kind of announced out there. Biden put that out to the public, essentially, really to put pressure on Israel and on Netanyahu to accept this deal, which has been in discussion for some weeks and months now. But Netanyahu is kind of between two different parts of his government. One is the more far-right flank, which have essentially said that if he accepts this ceasefire deal, that they will not only oppose the deal, but even pull out of the government and essentially push the government into elections. At the same time, Netanyahu is also facing pressure from the more centrist side of the war cabinet, from Gallant, from Gantz, who have also said if they don't start hearing more about a long-term vision, a day after strategy, they too will leave the government. So I think Netanyahu right now is trying to speak out of both sides of his mouth to these two parts of his government, as well as to the U.S. in trying to decide next moves.
I mean, he's in a very difficult position. Who has more power over him? Is it his government, his war cabinet, the voters, the regional powers, the UN, or his remaining Western allies?
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to juggle. I would say the two main actors are, one, the U.S., who is internationally the main supporter and backer for Israel. Of all foreign military aid that Israel gets, the U.S. provides about 75% of that, as well as, of course, the diplomatic backing. Domestically, the right-wing parties have more sway than the more centrist parties. They hold more seats, and they're really the ones whose support will make or break the government. So I think that those two extremes are not extremes, but those two sides are really what Netanyahu is stuck between. I will just note, Georgina, that I would also say, only about 40% of the Israeli public supports a ceasefire right now. About 30% is opposed, about 30% is unsure. So I would just note that it's not just Netanyahu. There are many elements within and across Israeli society who are hesitant about this.
And what is the latest on the proposed ceasefire deal?
Yeah, so the ceasefire deal was, again, something that the parties have been aware of for some time. It was made public, again, intentionally by Biden to try and pressure the parties to accept it. The real sticking point is the so-called phase 2, in which the initial temporary ceasefire would be negotiated into a permanent end to the conflict. That's the piece that Hamas wants to make sure is definitely there. And that's the piece that Israel wants to make sure that they have some wiggle room around, because they want the ability to be able to essentially achieve what they call their war aims with completely depleting Hamas's capability. So I think that's where that's where things hit before, and that's where we're seeing the reluctance to firmly commit right now.
Netanyahu said that Israel's prepared for very powerful action on its northern front with Lebanon's Hezbollah. I wonder if you could tell us what's happening there.
Sure. So obviously most of the attention of the war has been rightly on Gaza, but there has also been a sort of second front on the northern border with the border with Lebanon, with crossfire exchanges with Hezbollah for months now. Most of that has been somewhat contained to a relatively small border area, but it has caused increasing damage. There are tens of thousands of Israelis who have been displaced from that part of the country. Earlier this week, some of the strikes called massive wildfires in that part of Israel, and so that border has been just increasingly heating up, and it's one that Israel is saying, "Look, this is becoming unsustainable," and are have before, but I think right now are seriously considering more action there as well.
And the latest from within Gaza.
So we heard this morning that there was a strike on a UN school that Israel alleges Hamas was using as a base or a site for munitions. Obviously, many civilians were sheltering there as well. So we're already hearing, again, at least dozens of casualties from that strike, which I'm sure will be talked about more in the coming hours and days.
Julie, thank you very much indeed. That's Julie Norman there. Now, still to come on the programme, would you entrust your dating life to a government-run app? Well, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government seems to think so, and that their new plan might just save Japan's dwindling birth rate. We'll find out more ahead here on The Globalist. So let's continue with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Charles Hecker, and he has a forthcoming book about Russia and international business coming in August, is that right?
Coming out a little bit later, just in time for Christmas shopping in November.
Let's start with the Times. Slovakia's Robin Fico has recovered, it seems, from his assassination attempt. He's been talking to the papers.
That's right. We're going to the Times, and the Slovakian Prime Minister has made his first public appearance since an assassination attempt on May 15th, and he has come out swinging. Robert Fico says that he feels no hatred for the man who shot him, and instead has come out at every other political institution you can just about imagine, blaming them for the attack. The Prime Minister says that his assassin, or would-be assassin, was a messenger of evil and political hatred. He says, "I forgive him and let him sort out what he did and why he did it in his own head." I'm sure Slovakian law enforcement has other plans for the would-be assassin. But Robert Fico has told everybody in a Facebook post, by the way, which skirts the Slovakian media, which he distrusts and is trying to restructure. He lashed out at his political opponents. He lashed out at the EU. He lashed out at NATO. And he says he doesn't understand why he is being singled out and punished for views that are against the sort of the common wisdom of the European Union. We know that he's against supporting Ukraine, and he's a fairly favorable view of Vladimir Putin. He seems to sort of miss the point there on unanimity in the European Union. But really, in his first public appearance since recovering from grave, serious injuries, he's an angry man.
And I mean, one of the things he's very angry about, you mentioned the media, but he has been trying to completely overhaul public broadcasting. The opposition, of course, say this would give the government full control of public television and radio. He wants to amend the penal code to eliminate a special anti-graft prosecutor. There are so many areas in which he is being contentious.
That's right. He's taking some pages out of the playbook of some of his neighbors, and that is what happened under the PiS party in Poland, and what has been happening, gradually and for a long time under Viktor Orban in Hungary, and that is sort of consolidation of the media. And interestingly, as we noted at the very top of the story, he skirted the public broadcaster in releasing this statement by doing it on Facebook, and this is part of his gradual sort of cracking down on domestic opposition, and a overarching control of political systems in Slovakia.
Yeah. Remind you of anyone?
The list is increasingly long when we get to sort of those sorts of approaches to governing.
And one of them, of course, Donald Trump. But it does seem that there's been a small shift towards Biden after Trump's guilty verdict.
That's right. Now that President Trump's felony conviction has a few days on it, the New York Times, under a headline that says "Small Shift Towards Biden After Trump Verdict," has looked at the impact on voters. I mean, the easiest thing to track in the aftermath of the conviction was what happened to political fundraising. And the Trump fundraising website crashed under the burden of new donors in the immediate aftermath of the conviction. But now that there's a few days behind us, the Times has gone back to a pool of voters that it periodically polls on this topic. And what it has found is that in what promises to be a very close election, President Trump is losing about 7% of his supporters. And this is incredibly important. We know that there's a group of Trump voters who will never leave his side. We know that there's a group of anti-Trump voters who will always vote against him. Oh, and by the way, there's a new term in here, or at least new to me from the New York Times. There's a group of voters called double haters. And these are people who really aren't very happy at all with their choices coming up in November. They don't want to vote for Biden. They don't want to vote for Trump either. But in any case, any sort of leakage of support from this middle group of people that are up for grabs, that's what could decide the election going forward.
Yeah, but they do say that the voters who continue to support Trump appear to be more enthusiastic than ever.
This sort of event, the trial, the outcome, and the aftermath is just raw, dripping political red meat to the MAGA base. Trump has whipped them up into a rich lather by saying that this was a rigged trial, that it was promoted by the Biden government, and that they're out to get him. And by being out to get him, they're also out to get the little guy who Trump is standing in front of trying to protect.
Let's have a look now at New York City and the congestion pricing plan.
That's right. This is really a really interesting piece, and we're looking at a piece of coverage about New York City, but we're going to the FT about this that says New York indefinitely pauses Manhattan congestion pricing scheme. Now, anybody with a car in London, anybody with a car in Stockholm understands how these schemes work. You're charged a fee for driving into a particularly traffic-choked part of a city, and this was supposed to happen in New York City at the end of this month. So we're just really a few days away from a $15 congestion fee in New York City to drive essentially into Midtown. And that's Manhattan below sort of 60th Street. The governor of New York has suspended indefinitely this plan. And what Kathy Hochul, the Democratic governor of New York State, says that Manhattan has yet to fully recover from COVID. The office towers are not as full as she would like to see them. And also there is a cost of living crisis in the United States and specifically in New York State and New York City. What's interesting about this is that the governor has big-footed this plan because the state of New York, when it comes to transportation, has an outsized role in what happens in New York City because Albany, the capital, runs the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, not New York City.
Right. And of course, they must be taking a close look at London, where the mayor became very unpopular when he introduced that congestion charging.
That's right. These schemes take a very, very long time to agree and iron out and get everybody on board. And even when they're launched, they are unpopular. So New York has been discussing congestion charging since Michael Bloomberg was the mayor 10 years ago. The enabling legislation was passed 3 years ago, yet the controversy continues. And on the topic of political unpopularity, one of the governor's concerns is in the neighboring and quite wealthy and influential county of Westchester, just outside New York City. There's outrage. These are the people who are going to be driving in and out of Manhattan on a daily basis. They tend to vote Democrat. But with an upcoming congressional and general election, the governor's worried about leakage from those voters as well. And
now to the Japan Times. I know one of your favourite papers, Charles. What are they saying?
Well, we like to go to the Japan Times periodically, which gives us the opportunity to examine some of our assumptions about how that gorgeous country works. One of the things that we know about Japan is that it is an unfailingly polite society. But without digging too deep, you can find actually that there are elements of Japanese society that work the same as in countries all around the world. So the Japan Times headline is Labor Group Calls for Measures to Address Harassment from Customers. Now, a lot of us are accustomed to being treated somewhat dismissively by store staff when we walk into a commercial establishment. In Japan, store owners and store workers are pushing back against customers who are harassing them. And it shows that a poll of 33,000 Japanese workers showed that 46.8% of them had experienced customer harassment. So a big Japanese labor union is trying to put together a manual to help employers push back against their customers. This is particularly acute in the trains and aviation sectors where airline employees reported, just one at All Nippon Airlines, they reported 288 cases last year of customer abuse. Which is just astonishing. When you really think, I'm a student of the Japanese language and learning how many different degrees there are of politeness and deference and respect just embedded in the language itself, which means that you're essentially learning about 14 different languages at the same time. Verbal abuse in Japan was cited most often as the harassment that is most difficult to overcome. Complaints from customers are threatening, they're repetitive, and in certain cases, we learn again, digging deep into the story, that it is driving store workers into mental health clinics. It's really an acute problem in Japan, and I guess it's time to sort of return to your roots, dig deep into these languages, and learn the more respectful phrases for all of your verbs.
Absolutely, there must be lots of ways to swear. I guess. Charles, thank you very much indeed. That's Charles Hecker there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The leader of Hamas said yesterday the group will demand a permanent end to the war in Gaza and Israeli withdrawal as part of a ceasefire plan, dealing an apparent blow to a truce proposal touted last week by US President Joe Biden. Israel, meanwhile, said there would be no halt to fighting during ceasefire talks and launched a new assault on a central section of the Gaza Strip. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Wednesday he could deploy conventional missiles within striking distance of the United States and its European allies if they allowed Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia with long-range Western weapons. Putin, in his first face-to-face meeting with senior editors of international news agencies since the war in Ukraine began, said the West was wrong to assume Russia would never use nuclear weapons and said the Kremlin's nuclear doctrine should not be taken lightly. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's National Democratic Alliance formally named him on Wednesday to lead a new coalition government for a third straight term, a day after it regained power with a surprisingly slim majority. Modi, a populist who's dominated Indian politics since 2014, will for the first time head a government dependent on the support of regional allies, whose loyalties have wavered over time, which could complicate the new cabinet's reform agenda. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni travelled to Albania yesterday to thank the country for agreeing to host thousands of asylum seekers and to tour the sites of 2 immigrant detention centres under construction. The visit came just a day before local Italian and EU elections, where immigration is set to be a key issue. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Guy Delaunay, who's Monocle's Balkans correspondent. Good morning to you, Guy.
Morning, Georgina. Morning, everyone.
What is this deal all about?
Well, if you look at the practicalities, basically what's going on here is Italy is creating 2 facilities in Albania, one of them for initial reception, the other one for more long-term accommodation. And these are, not in beautiful places, particularly, I wouldn't say, Georgina. One of them is at an old military airport about 80 kilometres outside the capital, Tirana. The other one is actually at a port, Shenzhen. That's about 20 kilometres away from this other processing centre. And the idea is that a maximum of about 3,000 people at any one time can have their claims for asylum in Italy processed at these centres in Albania. And the whole idea of this 5-year deal between Albania and Italy is they reckon, and I think this is wildly optimistic, but they reckon that they can process 36,000 asylum claims per year in Albania for people who want to claim asylum in Italy.
Why is Italy doing this?
It is performative politics, a go-go, frankly, in my opinion, Georgina. I mean, at the moment, if we look at it this way, the number of asylum claims in Italy this year is down by about 50% on last year. There have been 21,574 people who've arrived in Italy by boat so far this year, so that's more or less half a year, compared to more than 50,000 during the same period last year. So we're doing this at a time when the number of people arriving is declining anyway. But Giorgia Meloni has always made out, and correctly in some regards, that Italy has been taking an unfair share of the burden with regards to dealing with people who are claiming asylum in the European Union. That she wants, and many other Italian politicians and Italian people want that burden to be spread out more equally. It's the perennial problem, and we hear lots about it. Now, she's painting this agreement with Albania as an innovative solution, which she reckons could be copied in other countries, that the European Union could take this approach, that she's a pioneer, and look at what we're doing here. We're getting people to have their asylum claims processed in Albania. We're going to do it more efficiently, she says, within 28 days for each person, and it's all terribly humane, and this is what everybody should be doing. And of course, the fact that she was making her visit just a couple of days before the European elections is purely coincidental.
And what's been the reaction in Albania?
Well, in Albania, Prime Minister Edi Rama is fully behind the deal, as you'd expect. Now, this gives him the chance to play European statesman. I mean, Edi Rama was very interesting yesterday during the visit. He's taking questions at the press conference and answering in Italian. This is Edi Rama will do Italian, he'll do English. He very much likes to perform on these sort of stages. And he was saying that Italy has always been our most important advocate in Brussels, and to have the honour of being useful here today is something we take as a blessing. So you see, he's very, very supportive indeed, as you'd expect. There's money involved as well, tens of millions of euros in it for Albania. The opposition were not happy. They said this was really surrendering Albanian sovereignty to another country. You shouldn't have another country operating facilities in Albania, because that's what's going to happen. I mean, Giorgia Meloni emphasising that these centres are going to be staffed by Italian personnel at great expense, I might add. And the opposition took that to the Constitutional Court, which ruled not by a unanimous decision, but it did rule that they could go ahead. It didn't break the Constitution. But you can see from that there's been a lot of disquiet on the political side of things. Though if you talk to ordinary Albanians, as the terrible phrase goes, they're saying, well, look, we've been refugees in the past ourselves. Other people have looked after us, whether that's in Britain, in Greece. This is now our turn to do our part in looking after refugees from other countries.
What's been the reaction from human rights organisations?
They're not happy, Georgina. So Amnesty International has been leading the objections, and you can understand why. I mean, when you look at what these centres look like, I mean, one of them's got a wall 5 metres high with razor wire on the top, and this does not look like a friendly place. And Amnesty have called the arrangement illegal and unworkable. They've compared the asylum centres to detention facilities. But Brussels and Ursula von der Leyen has said that these arrangements don't break EU laws, so they can actually go ahead.
Guy, thank you very much indeed. That's Guy Delaunay there, and you're with Monocle Radio. From From today, countries in the European Union will be voting to elect their new parliamentarians to send to Strasbourg. The results could also determine the next president of the European Commission in Brussels. Ursula von der Leyen, currently head of the EU's executive, is bidding for a second term. But in her home country of Germany, the government, led by Olaf Scholz, can hardly expect the same. Monocle's Chris Chermak reports on the election race in Europe's largest economy.
It wasn't so long ago that Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was a sort of standard-bearer in Europe, a leader of the pro-democracy movement and a perennial winner of German and European elections. Since her departure, it's fair to say that Germany's reputation in Europe has suffered. By contrast, her successor, Olaf Scholz, takes a quieter background-style approach to politics that is unfit for this day and age of loud and proud autocrats, right-wingers, left-wingers, and even centrists like France's Emmanuel Macron. Voters want to know what you stand for. As a result, Scholz's three-way governing coalition is woefully unpopular heading into these European elections. The Social Democrats, Greens and Free Democrats are polling around 30 to 35% in total between all three of them. The door has been left wide open for a return to dominance of the conservative Christian Democrats, Merkel's erstwhile party, now led by Friedrich Merz, who has reshaped the party in his own more hardline image but nevertheless remains a committed European.
We have to defend our values against populists and extremists from the far left and from the far right, all over Europe. These extremists, they want to dismantle the European project that has brought us decades of peace, freedom, and prosperity.
But even while the Christian Democrats are quietly leading the polls and Friedrich Merz rails against extremism, this year's European elections have indeed been dominated by the extremists, and news from the right-wing Alternative for Germany party in particular, which has had a rocky few weeks, to put things mildly.
Dr. Maximilian Krah.
Its lead candidate, Maximilian Krah, remains at the top of his party's voter list despite being officially suspended from campaigning by his own party. What prompted the suspension of sorts was not his various links to Russian spying allegations, but rather his prevarications on the SS, suggesting that not all members of the SS in the Second World War were criminals.
Viel aufgebaut, schöne Bürgerstädte, Wohlstand geschaffen. Und jetzt seht ihr vor euren Augen, wie es zerrinnen könnte.
Those comments were enough for the AfD's other European far-right parties, led by France's National Rally, to distance themselves from the AfD and basically excommunicate them from the far-right identity and democracy bloc in the European Parliament. Even the far-right, which has sought to moderate its image somewhat this year to show that it has the chops to govern, has clear standards, and defending the SS is not one of them. None of this has dented the Alternative for Germany's popularity, however, which sits around 15 to 20% in current polling, making them potentially the second largest German grouping in the European Parliament. Politico reports that Krah himself has even been emboldened to work towards an even further far-right grouping in the European Parliament, together with Poland's Confederation, Hungary's Our Homeland, the Netherlands' Forum for Democracy, Slovakia's Republic, and Bulgaria's Revival.
Ursula von der Leyen for the European People's Party.
The irony in all of this is that Ursula von der Leyen, a German national, is currently head of the European Commission and lobbying for another term. But she's no longer quite as German in her outlook.
We have to make sure that the fragmentation we have in the European Union stops, that we have common European projects, for example, an air defense shield for all of Europe.
In fact, she's departed so much from the German government's viewpoints, particularly by suggesting that she'd be willing to work with some of the more centrist far-right parties like Italy's Giorgia Meloni, that Berlin has declined to say whether they'll support her for another term. In other words, this European election comes at a crucial time for Germany's place in Europe, but Germany's own willingness to lead Europe is decidedly lacking. To make the case for why this should matter to Germans, the country's saner middle needs to rediscover its voice. For Monocle, I'm Chris Chermak.
Thank you, Chris. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's time now for a roundup of the latest trade and economy headlines with Vicky Price, an economist and former joint head of the UK government's economic service. Vicky, good morning to you.
Good morning.
As we've just been hearing, of course, the EU elections are this Sunday. Will we get a cut in rates before that?
Well, it's really rather interesting because we're having a debate like that here in the UK, where, of course, we're having the snap election in early July, and it's considered to be a very political thing, whether if interest rates come down here for the first time in ages, it will be helping possibly the government because it can demonstrate it's actually brought down interest rates as well. If they don't, then it's going to be obviously against them as well. So the general consensus here is that perhaps we're not going to see interest rates going down here at all or being touched until after the election. But in Europe, it doesn't seem to be quite the same because, of course, the ECB represents all countries. So in the Eurozone. And of course, you're having wider EU elections anyway. So the expectation is that, yes, we are going to see a cut in interest rates today, which will encourage, if you like, the others to also think about this. It's quite unusual because the expectation earlier had been that it would be the US first, followed by the UK possibly, and then the ECB. But of course, in Europe, we have seen a very substantial decline in inflation a lot earlier than happened, for example, in the UK and also in the US. And we've seen actually over the last few months, it's sort of changed now because, of course, we've had a longer period where service inflation has been slightly higher. But we've had deflation in some countries. So that, of course, would have encouraged the ECB to look at this a little bit more carefully. And we also got news, for example, from countries like Germany, where unemployment is still very high, and we're talking about an unemployment rate of 5.9%. We've seen actually a slight increase in the number of people, jobless people in Germany. So there is a real need to do something because although the economies in Europe are recovering, did reasonably well in the first quarter, we're still a long way from being certain that this growth is going to be sustainable.
Now, Canada has just cut its rate.
Yes, that's really interesting. They cut their rate from 5% to 4.75%. And that is actually the first cut they've fed themselves in a couple of years. And the interesting thing with them is that they have been rather worried about what's happening to their own economy. So what we have seen is I just mentioned unemployment. For example, I can do that there for Canada as well. We have unemployment of 6.1%. Which is really high. It's been rising again. It's the highest they've seen for a couple of years too. They have inflation, which is really rather low at sort of 2.7%, and you just wonder, whether you actually needed to have such high interest rates for any sustained period. And I think they're just looking at what their economy has been doing and worrying. And I think that's the underlying issue. Which we all have to consider when you're looking at what the decisions ahead might be for all those central banks. But of course, Canada is smaller country, not one of the big three. But nevertheless, it just indicates that, some other smaller countries in Europe have done that too, who are not part of the Eurozone. So we are seeing that trend going downwards.
So the Bank of Canada governor says that they don't need to move in lockstep with the US Federal Reserve and that it is reasonable to expect further cuts.
Yes. If indeed, the growth it doesn't pick up and unemployment stays high and their inflation stays at where it's been. They had growth, of course, in the first quarter. So it's not as if they're not doing anything in terms of the economy moving, because everyone has experienced the fall in inflation, which is actually good news. And it's encouraged people to go out and spend because their real earnings are improving, and businesses are also becoming a little bit more confident. But their GDP sort of growth was less than they expected in the first quarter. So they have been a little bit worried about this. And yes, they have decided that they can make up their own mind and go ahead and cut rates. And the expectation is that there will be more cuts coming this year. There could actually be one next month. So, yeah, it will be interesting to watch what Canada does, frankly.
And what about US cuts?
Yes, well, those are interesting because the expectation had been that perhaps nothing would happen until perhaps after the election, the presidential elections in the US, or we may not see anything until November. So the markets have become quite pessimistic. But what we're seeing now is a softening in some of the inflation data. And if that is indeed the case, then we may actually get something slightly earlier. So the market is re-estimating that perhaps we'll see some cuts, or the first cut happening in September. It's interesting because, of course, that would completely reverse what I was saying earlier, when we all thought that it would be the US first and the others coming after. But of course, we've got to bear in mind that the US economy is really quite strong. If you look at where countries are now compared to where they were pre-pandemic, the one that's done best of the G7 is the US. If I remember the data off the top of my head right this minute, they are over 8% above where they were pre-pandemic. So if you look at the UK, we're only 1.7%, and I think Germany is less than 0.5%. So that is obviously one of the factors that is making them think again, because of course you have quite a vibrant economy there, and the question is, if they cut rates too soon, will that reignite inflation? But the worldwide trends are favorable. So yes, it looks like they may cut rates earlier than we expected just a little while ago.
Here in Britain, of course, the Times reporting that private sector growth is boosting the economy.
Yes, we've had the latest PMI data, which look really quite good. And what's happening, of course, it's mainly services. But the interesting thing is that manufacturing is picking up. So we got some slight improvement in May after more than a year of falling output. So that is encouraging. But I think a lot of it is on the back of expectations of interest rates. If they don't happen, that's going to be an issue. But of course, uncertainty around the whole election period, the fact that it's come forward is actually good news in some ways, even though obviously there is uncertainty ahead as to exactly what the policies will be. And there have been big debates here in the UK about the various tax positions of the two main parties, very highly contested. Which are the right figures? Are we going to see tax increases by Labour? But overall, what we're seeing is that at least we'll get to the early July, and then there'll be some clarity as to what the policies will be, because for the moment they're still quite vague. So I think that's given businesses reasonable sort of expectations that things could stabilize after the election, because we had so much uncertainty before. So yes, a lot of that is due to politics in a way, but also, of course, the inflation trend downwards has been very helpful for businesses.
And just within that, employment in the services sector seems to be rising. But can we fill those jobs?
It's a question which lots of firms are pondering about. What you've got right now is the strange thing of course, the overall unemployment rate has gone up, but there are big vacancies still in particular areas. So when you talk about hospitality, for example, those are areas where there's been quite a lot of concern about being able to fill some of those jobs. But what you're also finding is that in other parts of the service sector, the economy is doing rather well. So business services, for example, if you look at some of the export data that's come out in the UK, services exports to the EU have risen quite significantly, and that entire sector is doing rather well. So they are looking for people, and there are shortages there too.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed. That's Vicky Price there, and this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, we expect many services from our local governments, but so far, playing Cupid has not featured. But that's about to change in Japan, where low birth rates have prompted the Tokyo metropolitan government to launch its own dating app this summer to encourage citizens to swipe right and breed for the nation. Fiona Wilson is Monocle's Tokyo bureau chief. She joins me on the line now. Fiona, what was the government research that showed that this would be a good idea?
Yes, you might well ask that question, Georgina. I think the problem is Japan, everybody knows this, the birth rate is really catastrophically low. You've got twice as many deaths as new babies, basically, at the moment. And, you know, there's going to be all the problems that you can imagine. You won't be able to pay for social care for older people, the labour shortage. You know, there are endless problems already. It's already starting to be obvious, but projections are pretty grim. So what the government, this is the Tokyo government, they looked at and they discovered that most of the people who are actively looking for partners do it through dating apps. And they thought one of the most important things they can bring is, or so they think, is trust. And apparently a lot of people, I can't believe it, but they go onto dating apps and they lie about what they're worth, how tall they are, what they look
Never.
like. So yes, hard to believe, isn't it? But the government has said, OK, if you sign up for this, they've got very strict rules. You have to prove that you're single, that you have to prove what you're earning. You have to prove that you want to get married. You're not interested in just sort of casual dating. It's not Tinder. It's meant to be a serious, attempt to get the marriage rate up. And this is the big problem in Japan. Most births happen within marriages still in Japan, same in South Korea, and fewer people than ever are getting married. So really, if you want to raise the birth rate, you have to raise the marriage rate, which is why the government has rather extraordinarily decided that a dating app is the way forward.
And it's already on trial. Has there been any public feedback?
I think a lot of people are quite surprised to hear about the cost that, you know, that the Tokyo city government is putting equivalent of €1 million into this project. But, you know, it's easy to sneer. But, there is a bit of a crisis. And the government, even, you know, yesterday a new law was enacted. Fumio Kishida said this is our last chance. They've just done a massive expansion of child allowance. They're improving maternity leave allowance. They're trying everything. They're throwing everything they can legally. I think their problem may be, you know, other surveys are showing that young people just don't really want to get married anymore. It's not just women who don't want to get married. Men also, they're saying we don't want to give up our freedom. They don't fancy the big financial obligations that will come with having children. So I think there's a long way to go. But this could be quite interesting. I mean, at the moment, they've just announced that it will be launched. It hasn't launched yet, but they're saying, you know, it could be this summer, so it's not far off.
And once people have met their match, I mean, how can procreation be guaranteed? Will this produce the pitter-patter of little results?
I mean, absolutely no guarantees. I think what they're trying to do with this particular app is filter out, you know, the chances who just want to meet someone. They're trying to make it. It's quite common, oddly, it may seem odd anyway if you're sitting in London, but local governments do organise meetups for people who want to get married. Now, Tokyo's never done an app. Probably Tokyo, you know, millions of people, you might well meet someone in the regular way. But in rural bits of Japan, it's not uncommon for local governments to slightly intervene in this process, and they have meetups. And I think the idea is that if you get involved in this process, you probably want to get married. You know, well, hopefully in this case, you have to say you want to get married, but you probably want to have children. And they're trying to, you know, increase the chances for those people who do want to have children.
I mean, as you say, they're also doing other things like, you know, subsidies and childcare allowances and maternity allowances. But, that famous, the pram and the hall is the enemy of promise. I think that was Cyril Connolly. Is there a concern that if it does work, a lot of young women will be temporarily removed from the workforce?
Well, I think that's, you know, there are so many things happening concurrently here. Certainly true that women have said, hang on a minute, we don't want to leave the workforce. Traditionally, women, once they've had children, have dropped out of the workforce. And the government's made a massive effort recently to make it possible for them to come back in. And that is what womenomics that Shinzo Abe was always going on about. Womenomics was the sort of big pillar of that, was getting women who've had children back into the workforce, because millions of very well-educated women were just disappearing from the workforce, and it just didn't make sense, even if they wanted to. So I think that is also going alongside. So they need to raise the marriage rate. Hopefully then the birth rate will start to increase, but also make it much easier for people who are having children to really meet the expenses. And everybody talks about the cost of having children in Japan.
Fiona Wilson, thank you very much indeed. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks to our producers, Vincent McAvaney, Carlotta Ribella and Sophie Monaghan-Coombs, our researcher, George Ruskin, and our studio manager, Tamsin Howard, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and The Briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.